Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on the world where you're tuning in from. This is Mishnah in-depth Kiddushin with Dr. Chanan Gafni, part of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division. This is the last class on this particular book of Mishnayot, and the last bit in our last class on taking place in Seder Nashim. Thank you everyone who's been joining us for the for at least what is now two Siddharim of Mishnah, and for Dr. Gafni's series. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gafni.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think what we'll do this is our last session. I feel guilty that I'm going to be celebrating with you, concluding the Seder Nashim today. Although I only joined in the last Masechet of both the Siddharim, Seder Zraim, Moed Nashim. I didn't take part in any of this, but I guess that's sometimes how things happen. I'm going to join share my screen with you, and we'll do a brief review over the stuff we did in the previous sessions and make some progress. In today's class, we have to cover two chapters rather than one, so we have a little bit more to do. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen, and okay. Kyla, you see it?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. So what have we done so far, and what are we about to do today? In the previous, so in the goal, I would say, of the current series, our current series now, is not just to talk about particular halachot, specific halachot, but to say something more broad, more general about the structure of the tractate and something about the way that the halachot were organized as part of this in this masechet, in this masechet Kiddushin. And again, we're not going to be putting our attention on particular halachot, but just get a general view. In the first session, we discussed the first chapter, and that was a really puzzling chapter, because rather than speaking about Kiddushin, it basically spoke about different types of kinyanim. How does one acquire a certain object? How does one purchase something? And also, it dealt with different classifications or categories of mitzvot. Mitzvot shazman grama, mitzvot shetmiyot ba'aretz, and it didn't really belong to our masechet. And our main goal was to discuss the reason why they were included, why were they incorporated in our masechet, in our tractate. Second unit was devoted to the second chapter, but again, we did not focus on any particular halacha, but something more general theme, and that was the shift from the terminology of kinyan to the terminology of kiddushin. We were trying to explain what does that make sense of this shift. Why does the Mishnah abandon its term from the first chapter of kinyan and move on to the term of kiddushin? So again, a more of the general theme. Here, the Talmud already addresses this question, but we try to explain it also from a more, from a modern, perhaps more modern perspective as well. In today's, or I will say one more thing, in our guiding theory was not just to follow what traditional scholars often did, which I would say is more technical suggestions, people who assume that when the Mishnah moves from one topic to another, it's just an associative thing, or when you use one term rather than other, it's done for a very technical reason, but rather look for more meaningful insights that explain these big questions, not just more local or technical types of explanations. And this is something that was very much developed in the last, I would say, certainly in the last century, even in the last few decades. There's more growing number of scholars who are more tuned to literary issues, even when we're dealing with Mishnah. Needless to say, when we study the Tanakh, so people are very familiar with these type of insights. But also when we deal with Mishnah, people are more sensitive and more tuned to literary issues. And sometimes that explains why the Mishnah deviates, or seems to deviate, from what it's supposed to be talking about. What we will do today is follow the same pattern, and study the third and fourth Mishnayot, and we will deal with different units within these prakim, within these chapters that don't seem to belong, and we'll try to give some more modern ideas, trying to explain why were they included, why were they put in our masechet. However, before we do that, we have to do the hard work, and the hard work is to do a very, very brief survey of the halachot in the Mishnayot, just so we get the general picture, and then we can address the specific units that trouble us within this section. The section that involves Ilchot Kiddushin, as we already saw last week, does not start from the third and certainly not from the fourth chapter. It already starts from the second chapter. So I want to briefly, really briefly review the halachot we saw in the second chapter. I'll just mention sections in the second chapter of Masechet Kiddushin. We'll do this very briefly because we saw that last week. We'll get a general picture of what's being discussed in the third and fourth chapters. And once we do that, we will be able to devote our attention to those troubling sections or units within that big, within this big piece. So as we said in the previous session, I'm doing this very briefly without an English translation accompanying every halacha. I'll just briefly address each Mishnah. So we said Perek Bet, second chapter, was divided. I think we divided it into 4 parts. The first, the opening Mishnah, in a sense, is an introduction to the whole Kiddushin process. It tells us briefly who is the person that does the Kiddushin. It could be the husband or some shaliach of his, some messenger of his. It speaks about the Isha that receives the Kiddushin. It also speaks briefly about the object that is being used for the purpose of Kiddushin, and that it has to be at least shve pruta. It has to be worth at least the value of a pruta. Then on, what did the Mishnah then do? The Mishnah then moves on and talks about misleading Kiddushin. Misleading, I mean, if the husband intends one thing, but he gives the, but he, at least he leaves the impression that he thinks, or he's meaning to do one thing, but then it turns out that he was actually giving his future wife some inaccurate information. It could involve the object that is being used for the Kiddushin. For example, in Mishnah Bet, he makes her, or leaves her with the impression that it's wine, but it turns out to be honey, or that he is rich. Here it's dealing with his identity, and he turns out to be poor. Mishnah Gimel, he's a Kohen, claims to be Kohen, but it turns out that he's a Levi. And it could also involve the process of the Kiddushin. He tells the Shaliach to do it in one place, but it turns out that it was in a different place. In all these cases, I think the term that is commonly used in the Mishnah is the word almenat. Almenat is not being used in the way that people would use this often in modern Hebrew language, in order that, but rather, I would say, giving her the impression, or almenat, under the assumption that so and so. So it's a slightly different meaning. Either way, the term is almenat. So this is misleading types of kiddushin. We moved on. We spoke about the kiddushin of multiple wives, or at least a person who's attempting to be mekadesh multiple wives. In Mishnah Vav, mekadesh shtei nashim. Mishnah Zayin, mekadesh isha uvita, or isha va'achota. So if you marry, you propose kiddushin to 2 sisters, or to a mother and her daughter. Obviously, these are not allowed, permittable kiddushin. So then the Mishnah discusses the status of such kiddushin, and at the end of the Mishnah, it starts addressing the new theme, which is the ownership over the object used for the kiddushin, and that involves if you use something that is part of a korban, of a sacrifice, kodashim, kodesh kodashim, or kodashim kalim, maaser sheni, ola, kilei kerem, and all these things. Here, the problem involves the ownership over the object used for the kiddushin. So that was more or less chapter 2. Now we're starting doing new stuff. Again, brief survey. What happens now? So Mishnah Kiddushin, 3rd chapter, in a sense goes back to the previous theme, the theme that was being discussed also in chapter 2, and that involves misleading Kiddushin. I called it conditional and misleading Kiddushin. The husband at least claims one thing, or makes a condition at the setting of, as a part of the setting of the Kiddushin, and it turns out that it's not necessarily what's going to happen. Sometimes it's a promise, and sometimes it's a fact that he's giving her that might be a distorted information. For example, if he says to her, "Harat mekudeshet li al menat sheyesh li b'makom ploni," on the condition that I have a house in a certain place, and it turns out that he doesn't own such property, or under the condition that I will give you something, and he might not do that. All of these are conditional and misleading types of Kiddushin. And here too, the halachot vary depending on the particular scenario or particular case. This goes on from the first Mishnah, from Mishnah Aleph, more or less till Mishnah Vav. Some of this is involving facts, and some of this is more about promises that he's trying to make for the future, and the Kiddushin might be dependent on his fulfillment of his condition. So this is the first part of the third chapter. You see here too, I emphasize the word almenat. So it goes back, sends us back to the same terminology that was being used in chapter 2 as well. Next theme. Kidashti et biti ve'ini yodea lemi kidashtiya. And later on, we deal with issues that involve ne'eman or non-ne'eman. I gave the title of this for this section as doubts surrounding the Kiddushin, all sorts of doubts surrounding the act of the Kiddushin. It could be doubts that the husband himself has. For example, in Mishnah Zayin, he says, I made Kiddushin for my daughter, but I forgot who the husband was. That could be one type of doubt. And sometimes it's a doubt that we, as outsiders, might have surrounding the Kiddushin. For example, he claims that he was Mekadesh, his daughter, when she was young, and she might not be young back then, and cases of that sort. So the questions here are all doubts surrounding the Kiddushin. This theme continues also later on in Mishnayot Tet, Yud, and Yud Aleph. Again, sometimes it's a doubt that involves what he doesn't know himself. Sometimes it's us that we are not sure. And as you see, sometimes it could be a matter of debate between the two parties. In Mishnah Yud, he says one thing, she says a different thing. Who do we trust? All of this is one big unit involving or dealing with doubts surrounding the Kiddushin. I hope you're following. We're doing this fast just to get a general sense. Next, now we get to the first surprising unit in this section, and that's the ancestry or lineage part of the chapter. In Hebrew, the term is yichus. Sometimes in English, people say yiches, right? But I was trying to find the proper word for this in English, so I suggest ancestry or lineage are the proper words. Here we're talking about matters that involve the understanding or determining who the parents of a certain person is. Here too, we can divide it into subunits, but they all fall under the category of lineage questions. In the first two mishnayot, still the end of third chapter, the main theme is the status of the vlad, of the descendant, of the child that is born. How do we define him exactly, right? So those are mishnayot, Yud Bet and Yud Gimel. How do we determine the status of the vlad, of the newborn? Is he mamzer? Is he natin? It could have different types of categories, how we define him. We moved on to the fourth chapter, and here we're still dealing with lineage or ancestry questions. But here, the issue is not so much the status of the vlad, of the descendant, but rather who is allowed to marry who to begin with. You see the term that repeats here again and again is lavo ze baze. Who is allowed to marry, who is allowed to create a marriage connection with whom. So this is the second part, but it still involves the origin of each one of those, each side of this couple. We're continuing. The third part of this ancestry lineage type of question involves kehuna, priesthood. Who could be married to a priest? And what's the status of a person who wants to marry or get into the family of priesthood in all sorts of cases? Here you see that the first two mishnayot employ the word livdok, or checking after somebody. Later on, the terms that repeat itself more and more, psula lekuna, shera lekuna. Is this woman eligible for a Kohen to marry a Kohen or not? So these are the type of questions. So we speak all about lineage kind of questions, some involving the status of the kid, some involve who is permissible, who is allowed to marry who. Sometimes it's issues that involve priesthood, getting into the family of priesthood. And what did I forget? And yeah, I think that's more or less the main themes or the main categories within this unit. At the very end, the Mishnah addresses doubts that might emerge regarding the status of a person. Here too, I included it as part of the ancestry lineage question. He says, Bni ze mamzer, he claims the son is a mamzer. Do we trust him or not? Or if both people say he's a mamzer, both parties, the wife and the husband, do we trust or not? So these are the type of questions that appear in this unit. The Mishnah, for one more halacha, in a surprising manner, goes back to doubts regarding or surrounding Kiddushin. That's in the end of Perek Daled, the 4th chapter. One independent Mishnah, for some reason, still goes back to this Eino Yadua type of questions. We don't know something. Here it's not about lineage type of questions. It's just questions surrounding the Kiddushin. And it moves back once again to lineage questions, status of certain people or certain kids. And finally, I hope you're managing to keep in track of what we're doing. The last 2 units of the Mishnah, one of them involves the matters of yichud, seclusion. I think that's the word I saw in the dictionary for this. I don't know what word would you use for halachot of yichud. Is there a word, common word in English rather than yichud? I don't know.
I mean,
Yichud.
I think just people in English who are talking about it use yichud, but seclusion seems to get the
that
sense
was
across.
the official word that I was able to track. I didn't know what word I was supposed to use. So we have a bunch of halachot surrounding yichud, and finally it leads to issues that involve earning a profession. The person is supposed to, what professions are suggested? What's an ideal profession? Should you stay in yeshiva or a job? All those questions. Those are the end. This is pretty much the end of the Masechet, and that takes us all the way to the end. And this is the last screen. This is basically the last halacha. So, if we want to summarize or review the main things we saw, I think that most of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th chapter involve Kiddushin, but I think we were already able to sense that some units didn't really feel that they belong here. And I want to address, there are 2 types of problems when you read a Mishnah, when you go through a whole Masechet. Sometimes the questions involve the order of halachot. For example, the halacha that asks Eino Yodea, the lack of knowledge, the doubts, that we would expect the Mishnah to put together as one section, but they were kind of separated into 2 parts. That's one type of question. We're not going to address those kind of questions. Or misleading Kiddushin, the almenat mishnayot. We would expect them to appear in one set as one part in one bunch, but the Mishnah decides to divide them into 2 separate places. So that's one type of question that involves the structure of a tractate that we will not be able to address now. What I did want us to address now are the units that don't really seem to belong to this Masechet, or at least not obviously the parts that belong here. And which parts am I referring to? So I think have a few parts in this chapter seem to me that they do not belong here. So which units did not really belong into our Masechet? Which parts of these 2 chapters that we just read don't really fit here? And I could even suggest, at least for some of these units, alternative places where I put it in the mishnayot. So which parts? The halachot that involve Kiddushin, I would say, fit our Masechet, right? What's strictly connected to doubts regarding halachot, misleading halachot, conditional Kiddushin, all those really fit in the Masechet because they have to do 100% with Kiddushin. But which parts, we can argue whether they fit here. Who wants to suggest? Which parts that we just addressed now, one can theoretically suggest alternative places to place them in the Mishnah.
The ancestry, Yuchasim.
Okay, so all the ancestry or lineage kind of questions, they're not really Kiddushin issues. They're more about the status of a child, who can marry a Kohen, for example. There are whole tractates that deal with halachot, laws of kehuna. I could see that easily be put in tractates that involve the temple or something about priests. It's not necessarily the right location for these type of halachot. That's right. What else? One, as we said, one part is the lineage or ancestry part. True, doesn't really belong here. What else?
I
You
think the
said
lineage does. I think the lineage does belong, but I
we'll
want to
try
see
to
where you're
explain.
going. I want to see where you're going with this, so I'm gonna
What
write
else?
down.
So that's one part. Okay, so I would say the first part that doesn't belong here maybe is the ancestry lineage unit. We can suggest alternative places to put in the Mishnah. It's actually dealing, a lot of this unit is dealing with the outcome of certain Kiddushin, but not the Kiddushin itself, right? It doesn't really address the status of the Kiddushin or how to propose the Kiddushin in the proper manner, but most of this unit is about the outcome of types of Kiddushin that perhaps were prohibited from the very start.
How
So
about
that's one unit.
How about you said the umnus, about
Excellent,
God
excellent,
working?
excellent. So the second, I would say two things. The yichud part. Yichud, for example, I would suggest if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi approached me, if Rabbi approached me and asked me, I would say maybe that belongs to Masechet Sotah, for example. Because Masechet Sotah deals with all those scenarios that lead into problems within the marriage, right? Husband meeting somebody, we don't know what he was doing with her. That kind of belongs there. Yichud is that's the nature of these type of situations. So maybe put it in Masechet Sotah. And finally, the profession unit, right? Which job to find? I would put it. I wouldn't put it in Masechet Kiddushin. I would start by putting it. I would say maybe Masechet Avot. Masechet Avot gives us all this musar. Yafet Talmud Torah in Derech Eretz. Derech Eretz in Leshon Chazal often means acquiring a job or living your life in a natural manner, not just assuming that everything will happen on their own. So I would suggest that Mishnah to appear in Masechet Avot, for example. So all these units don't really belong in our Masechet. So how do we deal with these type of sections? How do we deal with those sections that don't really feel 100% in place? As we saw also in
It
the
seems
first
to me,
chapter,
though, that there is a connection to all of them. They all have to do with which Kiddushin are legal in all respects, whether it's his profession that makes something, whether the contract is valid or not.
yeah, but telling a person what profession to use, should you be a doctor or a lawyer or I don't know, that's not about Kiddushin. All these, sages recommend
Right.
what type of jobs one is supposed to look for. That's nothing about
Right, that's true.
Kiddushin,
Yeah.
right? And also Yichud, the Yichud part, it's telling you you're not supposed to be isolated with somebody in a closed room. What does that have to do with Kiddushin? Nobody's attempting to do a Kiddushin. So why address this issue here? It could be in other Masechtot. I would suggest, again, Masechet Sotah is the proper place. You're talking about all sorts of, people being suspected for doing things wrong. So the Mishnah could then end by saying, you know what, if you want to avoid all these problems, if you don't want to get into these doubtful suspicions about your life, just don't be mityached, don't do yichud with anybody. That would
Right,
be a very
but the
natural
units
place for
on
them.
kahuna and on the lineage, that all seems to belong.
Okay, so even the lineage, I think it belongs to a certain extent, but not all of it, because the parts that deal with the outcome of a kiddushin that are not valid is not really about the kiddushin itself. It's more about what will be the outcome later on. Okay, I hear what you're saying. In either way, so let's try to at least suggest a few ways that modern scholars deal with. But before we deal with modern scholars, I want to say that here too, just like we saw in the opening unit of Masechet Kiddushin in the first chapter, we saw that traditional scholars often look at the Mishnah as this book that is being written in a very associative manner. So you mentioned one halacha, Isha niknet, and you say the word niknet. Oh, that reminds me. Let's talk about all of the kinyanim. And then you say, oh, we spoke about Isha. So let's talk about mitzvot that nashim are exempt from, and you start dealing with that. So the traditional way was very much to view this as a form of associative thinking. One thing leads to the other, even though it does not really belong into this masechet. So some scholars also read our masechet and the two chapters we were just looking now in such a manner. Especially, let's start with the last two parts, with the part about the yichud and the part of the omanut. So some scholars would suggest For example, the following, come up with the following suggestion. So scholars might suggest the Mishnah spoke about all sorts of problematic yichus issues, right? And one of them is, for example, mamzer. Now, mamzer is often an outcome of a connection between ish ve'ishar, a male and a female, that was not supposed to happen from the very start. So maybe the Mishnah says, oh, we spoke about mamzer. We have this issue of, in the 4th chapter, towards the end, we have these issues or these questions involving doubts whether the son is mamzer or not. If a man declares here in the Hebrew, ha'omer bni ze mamzer eino ne'eman. In English, if a man declares this son is of mine, the son of mine is a mamzer, so he's not believed. So we mentioned the theme of mamzerut, and maybe the Mishnah said, oh, what could lead to mamzerut? Perhaps this is an outcome of yichud. So therefore, the Mishnah might say, you know what? You want to avoid mamzerim. You don't want to have these mamzerim be born. Perhaps don't isolate yourself or don't be secluded. Lo yityached adam im shtei nashim. One may not be secluded with 2 women. So that's Mishnah Yomit. And maybe once they mentioned Hilchot Yichud, the halachot of Yichud, so they started dealing with that. And one of the halachot of Yichud is, it says, among other halachot, Kol she'isko im anashim lo yityached im anashim, ve'lo yelamed adam et bno umanut ben hanashim. So whoever's business is with women should not be alone with women, and one should not teach his son a profession that would cause him to be among women. Oh, so we mentioned the word profession. So let's start talking about professions in general. So that's one way of looking at it. So one thing leads to the other in a rather associative manner. So you mentioned mamzer, so that led us thinking about yichud. Oh, you mentioned yichud, it made us think about different professions that are problematic from a yichud perspective. And once we mentioned that, let's talk about omanut in more general manner. So that's one way of looking at it. That's the traditional way that most scholars read this. I would say up to the 20th century, you would rarely see people who try to talk about the structure of the tractate in more broad terms and try to think more meaningful insights or more deep observations that one can derive from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi decides to include all these small parts or small units within the big within this Masechet. However, as I said, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, things changed drastically. The scholarship of the Mishnah is really very, very different in the last this last period. A few scholars, and we'll mention one of the people who are the founders in this realm, who are much more tuned to literary issues or literary sensitivities while analyzing the Mishnah. And that was the literary observations let scholars see that the Mishnah is much more planned and structured. Things are not just brought in the Mishnah in an associative manner, because you see all these patterns that connects different part of an entire tractate. One chapter connects to the other, and you see that all these things are there for a reason. And the same was true when we deal with our current mishnayot, and we're going to try to see a few of these modern observations that were addressed by scholars in the last few years. So I said this is a fairly new type of way of analyzing the Mishnah, and one of the important scholars in this realm is Avraham Wolfish. I'm sure you heard of him. I think he was probably teaching in many of the Drisha seminars. Kyla, right? Am I right? He's Rabbi Silber's family, right?
Yes.
And he's been here many times, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I knew that you will be familiar with his name. So he wrote an article called Ha'aricha HaYotzeret V'Koach HaYetzer. I won't even bother trying to translate this. I don't know what exactly he had in mind. And what he's saying, there is iyun be'arichat Mishnah Masechet Kiddushin ba'Mishnah ba'Tosefta u'ba'Vavi. So he's trying to come up with some observations about the way that Masechet Kiddushin is structured both in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta, and in the Bava. So his article is mainly devoted to the end of the 4th chapter. We were asking before, at the beginning, why does the author, why does the editor of the Mishnah decide to include these mishnayot? Rather than saying this is all a matter of associative thinking, Rabbi Wolfish shows that there are all these interesting connections between different chapters of the Masechet that lead him, and I think lead many people to say that it's not just a coincidence the way the Mishnah is being structured. While comparing, he was comparing especially the end of chapter 4 with the end of chapter 1. And we'll read two mishnayot that we saw before, but now I think you will see that there are different interesting connections between these two mishnayot. In chapter 1 we read, I'll read the Hebrew, somebody can read the English for me. Kol mitzvot haben al ha'av, anashim chayavim v'nashim pturot. So the Mishnah, I'll read the whole section, and I'm skipping a little bit. Kol sheyeshno b'mikra, b'mishnah u'v'derech eretz, lo b'mera הוא חוטא. שנאמר, והחוט המשולש לא במהרה יינתק. ככל שאינו, לא במקרא ולא במשנה ולא בדרך ארץ, אינו מן היישוב. Who wants to do the English? All obligations.
I can do it.
Okay, great.
Sure. All obligations of the son upon the father, men are obligated, but women are exempt. He who is familiar with Bible, Mishnah, and the ways of the land will not easily sin, as it is said, and a threefold cord is not easily broken. But he was not familiar with, but he was not familiar with Bible, Mishnah, and proper social behavior. Derech Eretz does not belong to civilization.
Okay, so I highlighted, or I put in bold letters, some key words here, and you will soon see why I chose those words in particular. The translation for Derech Eretz here is rather problematic. I tried to look for what I would find most fitting. Derech Eretz does not necessarily mean, as you see here, proper social behavior. Very often it means a person being or earning his living in a natural manner, let's say. This is what we have in the end of first chapter. And then we move on to the end of fourth chapter. And look what we have here. Lo yelamed adam et bno omanut ben hanashim. And later on, Rabbi Nehorai omer, maniach ani kol amanut shebaolam, ve'ni melamed et bni ela Torah. English, Kyla, you want to do English again?
Sure, for this one. And one should not teach his son a profession that would cause him to be among women. Rabbi Nehorai says, I leave aside all professions in the world, and I do not teach my son anything other than Torah, for a person enjoys its reward in this world, and the principle remains in the world to come.
Okay, so these are the ends of two chapters, first chapter and fourth chapter. And I think when you read them together, you see that there are a bunch of key words that form a very interesting connection. What are the key words? You see here? So we have father-son type of relationship, mitzvot haben al ha'av, and the person teaching his son, instructing your son doing something. You have nashim, we have omanut, and we have, or derech eretz, which is the equivalent word for omanut, and we have Torah, mikra Torah. Now, if you are not 100% convinced, and I'm 100% convinced that this is not something that is just random, but there is a connection. There is an interesting connection. You talk about similar elements that the Mishnah has in its mind, but if you're not 100% convinced, it's even more visible when you see this in the Tosefta. I'll just say a word about the Tosefta. The Tosefta is a text that scholars today doubt whether it's parallel or should be viewed as an interpretation or reaction to the Mishnah. Some scholars say maybe it even preceded the Mishnah, but either way, one can reflect or shed some light on the other source. And in the Tosefta, a lot of these elements are even more visible. The Tosefta elaborates and asks, Ezohi mitzvat av halaben? What are those mitzvot that the father is obligated to do with regards to his son? Again, this is Tosefta Perek Aleph, the end of first chapter. And it mentions the father is obligated, lemulo, circumcise his son, liftoto, to redeem him, to pidyon haben, lelamdo Torah, lelamdo omanut, leasio isha. And it continues. Some people say even has to teach him how to swim, or hashito banahar. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you don't teach your son any form of omanut, kol sheino melamed et bno omanut, ke'ilu melamdo listut. Why is that ke'ilu melamdo listut? Why is not teaching your son a profession is as if you're teaching him to become a thief or a robber.
Because if you don't teach him a way to support himself, that's all that he will be forced to do.
Metsuyan, exactly. And then later on, Rabbi Yossi Omer Mishum Rabban Gamliel, Kol Shebeyado Omanut, if a person who has a job or has a profession, Lemahu Domeh, what is he similar to, what is he equivalent to? Leisha Sheyesh La Ba'al, Ben She Mitkashetet, Uven She'ina Mitkashetet, whether she's putting on her makeup or attempts to look fancy, and whether she does not, Ena Kol Mistaklim Ba, nobody would even pay attention to her. Once she's married, she's fixed. This is the first chapter of Tosefta. You see here again, Av, Ben, Torah, Omanut, Isha, all these elements come. And again, in the end of the 5th chapter in the Tosefta has 5 chapters. Rabbi Nehorai Omer Maniach, Ani Kol Omanut Shebaolam, Ve'ani Melamed Et Bni Ela Torah. Later on, he elaborates and talks more about the importance of learning Omanut. And I skip a few lines here. It's a long text. Later on, Rabbi Omer, Leolam Yishtader Adam, person should make a big effort. Ve'elamed et bno omanut nekiya migezel. Here too, we have this element or theme of not becoming a thief. So you should teach your son the type of job, the type of profession that will allow you to make your money in a rather honest way. So we have all these words here, and I think, and this is something that scholars today are very much into, trying to look for these linguistic or similar terminology that appears in different prakim, and that indicates that there's a lot of thought put into this Mishnah. The Mishnah is not just introducing halachot in a cut and paste manner that he's just collecting stuff from all over and placing them one near each other, because you see all these patterns that appear again and again and again. And this is just one example, but he was able to demonstrate this in many masechtot. Very often, the end of different chapters of the masechet are forming all sorts of connections. Also, beginning of a chapter and the end of the chapter. Also in Kiddushin, I will leave this for you to check out. Different connections, opening words of a chapter, end of a chapter, or end of chapter number 1 and end of chapter number 4. In many masechtot, form these connections. So the first important aspect here or insight is to show that there's some thinking involved in the way that the Mishnah is structured. What becomes a little bit more speculative is to understand, so what is the Mishnah trying to tell us by including all those elements together? Or in our particular case, we have, I would say, 3 important elements that appear in our Mishnah. Something about Torah, something about a job, and maybe something about marriage. Maybe I could add also father-son type of relationship. Any suggestions? From here, now, at this point, your ideas are as good as anybody's. I mean, there's no way of proving. Maybe what is the Mishnah? What could the Mishnah possibly be teaching us by combining all these things together, repeating the same elements in one's life, profession, Torah, Omanut, over and over again? Maybe the Mishnah is trying to say something more general and not just something that came to mind in an associative manner.
I think that it's one big picture of what makes a marriage work.
Exactly.
You need
Beautiful.
all the
That's what I
ingredients.
was thinking too. It's about a Jewish home, how to make a Jewish home work out. You agree with me, right? What would be making your marriage last long, or how things will be more stable? And it tells us something about the elements that are supposed to be there. So obviously it's about marrying, but it also will involve some Torah, some Mikra, Mishnah in your house, and maybe also the fact that your ability to earn a living, because if you don't earn a living, that leads to trouble. So I think this is the more visible and more expected type of idea that I would say. He himself, this is Wolfish himself. So first I want to see how he presents this, the connection itself, and I'll also say a few words briefly about his way of understanding the connections between these 2 units. So he starts by saying, "Hakesher haleshoni hamuvhak," this clearly or very visible linguistic connection ben mishnat hapticha lemishnat hasiyum shel perek hamitzvot, מאשר ומעמיק את הקשר הענייני ביניהם סביב המוטיבים המשותפים של התורה והאומנות. So opening and ending parts of some parts in the Mishnah emphasize the connection between Torah and Omanut. And he also says, Shtei mishnayot hamemasgerot et perek hamitzvot. So the last two mishnayot of the first chapter, perek hamitzvot, the chapter that deals with mitzvot, umishnat hasiyum shel hamasechet, and the ending mishnah of the entire masechet, hem chut meshulash hamavlit et chashivutam shel hamotivim hameshutafim leshloshtam. So the mishnah is trying to emphasize the common themes that connect both, or that join the entire masechet, which is Torah, Omanut, and we can also add marriage. Wolfish himself has something more particular to say about this connection, and his idea is that the Mishnah is trying to teach us that true, the goal is to gain the right type of marriage. But in order to find your right wife and establish the home in the right way, you have to do it in a very particular manner. And it means that sometimes you have to put restrictions on the way you learn Torah, or restrictions on how to find your profession. So he suggests that the Mishnah is trying to put all those limitations. When you look for a job, don't do this. Don't look for professions that will involve you dealing with other women, because that will put pressure or expose your house into certain problems. Also, the Mishnah talks about learning Torah with nashim, with women, and he says that too. A person should not be sofer ima nashim. So what he suggests is that the Mishnah is saying something more specific and more particular about the connection between these two elements. Marriage is the thing we're supposed to aim for, but sometimes in order to gain or to establish a family or home that will last, we have to also put some restrictions or some limitations on one's ability to earn a living, or on one's ability to learn Torah the way he wants to. So this is Wolfish's particular insight. We don't have to accept his particular analysis, but I think what we can learn from what he's saying, that there are always these deep ideas that are hidden in the Mishnah. Other ideas are also suggested, and I want to talk about an additional observation by some other scholar. And this scholar deals with not just the profession or yichud unit, but also the part that we were addressing at the beginning, the lineage or ancestry part of the Mishnah. So if you recall, we were a little bit troubled by this section. Why does the Mishnah teach us here what types of marriages are allowed and what types of marriages are prohibited? And why does the Mishnah bother dealing with all the descendants and the cases that one is supposed to or allowed to be marrying a Kohen, become part of the priestly family, in what cases one is not allowed to do that? So one way of looking at it, and is the way I wanted to expose you to the writings of Ze'ev Safrai. Do you hear of him? Ze'ev Safrai is now very important, has a very important study on the Mishnah. It's a whole series called Mishnat Eretz Israel. It's an attempt to study the Mishnah from within a historical and cultural context, not just viewing the Mishnah through the lens of later interpreters, but also to try to see the Mishnah within its historical context. And he has very interesting observations. He's almost completing the entire Shas Mishnayot. I'm talking about many, many volumes. It's not a cheap purchase to make. So he has also, it's called Mishnat Eretz Israel. It came out in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. And he has two interesting observations on our Mishnayot as well. So the first one is more expected, and maybe that's what you were saying at the beginning. The more obvious way of explaining the lineage or ancestry section in the Mishnah is to say that this is an elaboration of a very important theme of Kiddushin. The first Mishnah, I'll read a few words of what he says. Halacha Rishit beperek, or the opening halacha of Masechet Kiddushin is Ha'isha niknet b'shlosha drachim, bekesef, bepruta, uveshve pruta. So it talks about two parties involved in the Kiddushin, Ha'ish, Ha'isha, and it talks about the process, and it talks about the object that is being used for the Kiddushin. One way of viewing the entire Masechet is an elaboration of the different elements of this equation that appears in the beginning. So some of the issues might involve zehut. What is zehut? In Hebrew?
Identity.
Identity, right? So some issues involve the identity of the husband or of the wife. Mi koneh, mi, who's the person who's purchasing who? Does it have to be done in a direct manner, or can you use a shaliach, somebody to do it for you? And what happens if there's a mistake surrounding the identity? People think he's a Kohen and he turns out to be a Levi. So that's one type of set of questions that all come up or all rooted in the identity question or identity theme. Another element is chefetz HaKiddushin, not the identity of the mekadesh or mitkadesh. It's not the identity of the husband or the wife, but rather the object that is being used. It has to be worth a puta. What happens if it's not? Ma koreh kasher yesh ta'ut b'chefetz. What happens if there's a mistake surrounding the object? You thought it was wine and it turns out to be honey. Ha'im nitan lekadesh b'chol neches. Can one use any object for marriage? Or also, one is allowed to use a sacrifice or maaser sheni. So if you just picture in your head, let's say we would use different colors for highlighting the Mishnah. So maybe we will highlight the identity type of questions. That will be one part of this Mishnah, of the tractate. Another color will be designated for issues that involve the object. 3, T'nai b'Kiddushin, putting certain conditions on the Kiddushin. Mama Amadam, what's the status of all sorts of Kiddushin that are dependent on something? Mama Amadam shel Kiddushim atluyim b'davar. And finally, Yuchasin, lineage. Lemi mutar linaseh ze lazeh, right? Not just what's the husband, who's the wife, what's the object, what's the process, but also who is one allowed to marry. So one might argue that the entire section of the lineage is rooted in the question of who is one allowed to marry. So one way, and maybe that's the more obvious or more expected manner that one might explain the ancestry or lineage type of section in our Mishnah, to say that this is an attempt to address the question, who is one supposed to marry? But then he continues, and I liked his brief, a few lines that he adds later on that I thought might put or shed a different light or present a different perspective on this. If you recall, we were troubled by a bunch of units. We were troubled by the ancestry or lineage question, but we were also troubled by the yichud and also by the omanut type of question. What Safai now proceeds and suggests is that maybe there's an interesting connection or statement, hidden, subtle statement that the Mishnah is trying to introduce by introducing both themes in our Masechet. He ends by saying, talks about ending of Masechtot, that in many Masechtot we have sort of Agadah at the very end. But then he says the following words. At the end of the Mishnah, he says, Yesh isuk rav, there's a lot of talking about bchira shel avodot v'itnagut, the type of profession one is supposed to choose or adopt. And he says the following line, and I thought that was an interesting observation. Yitachen, perhaps, shematrata, maybe the goal, the purpose of this, lehadgish hitnagut tova ke'erech ha'adif al pnei hayichusin. Maybe by combining these two themes together in the Mishnah, lineage, yichus at the beginning, and at the end, profession, the right, the honest profession, maybe the Mishnah is trying to give us a very subtle insight by saying, instead of putting so much efforts when you marry somebody or you're trying to find somebody, instead of putting so much attention on the yichus, who the family is from, is she from a Kohen family? Is her grandfather a famous rabbi? Is he coming from a wealthy family? Perhaps one is supposed to think much more about the husband himself and about the type of living he's going to make and the nature of or his character. Imkach, if this is true, harei sheyesh baketa, if this is true, the ending passage in the Mishnah is a tshuva chatranit. I would say it's a response, subtle response לעיסוק הרב ביוחסין שבכל הפרק. It's kind of subtle reaction to this big discussion or occupation with the theme of yichus. So the Mishnah is saying many people devote all their attention to yichus, but that's not necessarily what one is supposed to focus on. Perhaps what should be more important to you is to look for a husband that has a job, a husband that that earns his living in an honest way. If this is true, so it might be a literary addition to the Mishnah, a literary attempt to add something to the Mishnah that is saying something much more meaningful about how one is supposed to form his home. But it's not so much about the mixture, the right mixture between Torah, job, profession, and your wife, but rather what should be the criteria that you're supposed to follow while choosing your wife or while choosing your husband. Don't look for the yichus. Look for what's present now, what's visible. Yes, Debbie.
It's a subtle counterbalance.
Counter, exactly. That's that. I thought it was a very cute idea because it doesn't present the last halacha as something that just slips off Rabbi Yehuda's mind in an associative manner. It's something very important about the theme of Kiddushin, right? How often do we hear of people who put so much attention on which family they want to get into, which family they want to marry, and they're not addressing the real important stuff that they should be taking into account. Yes, Debbie?
No, I think it elevates it from something that was just sort of stuffed in there to a very thought out, profound, meaningful addition that wasn't really an addition, because if you look at it, it plays off the beginning, and it's contextually really woven into it when you really look at it.
Right.
It fits in linguistically much better.
Yeah. The first answer that he says about the yichus part is convincing. You could say it belongs to the Masechet, but I think it's not just a way of addressing the halachot of yichus. It's saying a statement about the whole concept of yichus more generally. One last thing, and then we're done. We're almost done. So this is the lineage versus profession type of question. One more thing I wanted to mention. I felt obligated to mention. I have a friend in Israel. His name is Yair Fürstenberg. Did you hear him? He teaches Talmud at the Hebrew University Talmud department, and he's doing a very important project of comparing Jewish and non-Jewish, or more particularly Roman law at the time of the Mishnah. And one of the things that he discovered or argues, is that there's great similarity between Roman law or Roman legal compositions that address the different types of status of different people within the Roman state. It could be an independent person, a servant, females, little children, and he saw some similarities between laws in Roman compilations in comparison to our Mishnah. And what he suggested is that if you view our Mishnah from that perspective, you might be able to understand not just the last section that talks about yichus, but also the earlier parts of the Mishnah, that he believes it's all a matter of how you divide your society. So you can divide it between males, females, slaves, maidservants, and all that stuff. And he feels that if we think of our Mishnah and compare it to those legal type of compositions, that might also give us a better sense of how to understand these mishnayot. So this type of scholarship is just starting and becoming very, it's a very big project, and they're trying to study systematically the entire Shas mishnayot in light of these comparisons. And he did find some interesting observations specifically regarding Masechet Kiddushin. If you're interested in more specific sources on this type of comparison, I will give you here. I just quoted a few sentences that might give us a bit of a sense of what he's saying. I'm not going to read this out loud because I think we're if you don't see the entire article, it's not even, you don't fully appreciate the type of work he's doing. With that, I think we're concluding Seder Nashim. But I wanted to add, complete our Mishnah with quoting one more text from our Masechet. This is from the first chapter, the last Mishnah of the first chapter, I think. And the Mishnah says, Kol ha'oseh mitzvah achat, meitivin lo, u'ma'arichin lo et yamav, v'nochel et ha'aretz. Scholars argue, what does this mean? If a person does one mitzvah, that's all that it needs in order to be meitiv lo, to earn good, or to la'arich lo yamav, and to be able to be nochel et ha'aretz. And there are all sorts of suggestions. Some people say it's talking particularly about mitzvat kibud avaim, where the Torah says lema'ani tavlach v'arachta yamim. So that could be one idea. Some people say it's referring to the mitzvah of believing in God, right? If you remember, there's a Masechet in Masechet Makot. The Gemara concludes by saying that each tells us that there are taryag mitzvot, but each one of the prophets said, you know what? If you keep a smaller number, but you're determined to be precise about those mitzvot, so maybe that would be enough. And the last prophet is Chavakuk that says tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh. It's just enough. It's if you just keep your faith, maybe that's enough for you. But I think the simple way of reading the Mishnah is as it sounds. Kol ha'oseh mitzvah achat. If you just choose one mitzvah and you devote yourself to that mitzvah, that already justifies meitivin lo u'ma'arichin lo yamav v'nochel et ha'aretz. So let's hope that each one of us will take upon himself even one mitzvah, and even a one-time mitzvah, and perhaps with that zchut, we'll be able to be zocheh with the bracha of the Mishnah, shemetivim lo u'ma'arichin lo yamav, and we also could use some bracha for limchol et ha'aretz, because as you can tell, things are a little bit, we could use some help now. So with that, Kyla, I'm returning to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gafni, for finishing up the series, this Seder on such this Masechet on a lovely note. For everyone who's joined us for part of the series, for the entire series, thank you for coming and learning, and it's always a pleasure.